Help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Hotels have always fascinated me. The idea of places that host people from all corners of the world, each room with its own story, has always seemed intriguing. But 2 years ago, that curiosity led me to an abandoned hotel. And what happened there showed me that some stories should remain forgotten. The hotel was located on a remote road, about 40 minutes from the city. It had been closed years ago, and no one really knew why. Some said it was due to lack of business. Others claimed something more sinister had happened there. I was driving with my friend Raphael on a Friday night when we decided to stop. It was around 10 p.m. and the hotel appeared on the road like a massive shadow. Its windows were broken and the facade was covered in moss and vines. "Are you brave enough to go in?" Raphael said, challenging me with a smile. I didn't want to seem scared, so I agreed. We parked the car and grabbed our flashlights. The main lobby was vast, under our feet, but held up. In the hallway, the doors to the rooms were ajar, and the wallpaper was torn in several places. It was then that we heard the first sound, a faint scratching coming from the end of the hallway. "Did you hear that?" I asked, trying to hide my nervousness. Raphael nodded, but pretended to be unconcerned. "It must be a rat," he said. We walked toward the sound, our flashlights trembling in our hands. When we reached the last door in the hallway, we saw something that made us stop. The door was closed, but the marks on the floor suggested it had been opened recently. Raphael pushed the door slowly, revealing a small, dark room. In the center was an old bed with torn sheets and a chair turned on its side. But what really caught our attention was the mirror on the wall. It was intact, unlike everything around it, and reflected the room perfectly. But for a brief moment, I swear I saw something move without a reflection. "Let's get out of here," Raphael said, but he seemed hypnotized by the mirror. When I finally responded, I said something that sent chills down my spine. "There's someone here." Before I could react, the door to the room slammed shut with a bang, and Raphael's flashlight went out. We were left in the dark, only hearing our breaths and something else. It was a low sound, almost a whisper, coming from all around. I couldn't make out the words, but they were rhythmic, like a prayer or chant. My flashlight flickered, illuminating the mirror for a fraction of a second. It was enough to see a figure standing behind us, motionless and completely dark, like a solid shadow. Raphael commented, and that snapped me out of my trance. We ran for the door, but it felt locked. When I finally managed to open it, the hallway was different. The doors, which had been ajar before, were now fully open, and footsteps echoed somewhere above us. We descended the stairs as quickly as we could, trying not to look back. When we reached the lobby, we saw something that made us stop again. The keys that had been lying on the floor were now perfectly arranged on the shelves, aligned just right. We didn't stay to find out more. We ran to the car and drove non-stop until we reached the city. The next morning, Raphael showed me the photos he had taken in the hotel. In one of them, taken in the hallway, there was something strange in the background. It was an indistinct figure, looking directly at the camera. I never truly went back to that road. Some doors, once opened, should never be crossed again. Report 3. Most people avoid abandoned places, but I have always been drawn to them. For me, exploring forgotten buildings was a way to imagine the past, to understand what they once were. An abandoned hotel on the outskirts of my town was my next target. It had been closed for decades, isolated by a rarely used road. I always heard rumors about the place, but I never paid much attention. That night I discovered that some stories are not just rumors. I arrived at the hotel around 11 p.m. The building was massive, with 3 stories, broken windows, and a facade that seemed to be crumbling little by little. Vines covered much of the walls, and the only light came from the moon, which barely illuminated the entrance hall. My friend Daniel came with me. He was just as curious as I was, and I discovered it would be fun to go through it all. "If we find a ghost, we'll be famous," he joked, holding his camera. We forced the main door, which creaked loudly as it gave way. The foyer was exactly what I expected. Dust covering everything, old furniture, and a silence that seemed even louder in the emptiness of the place. We began exploring the ground floor, passing through hallways with stained walls and broken floors. The air was heavy, humid, and the smell of mold was almost suffocating. "Imagine this, full of people decades ago," Daniel said, filming what was left of an old restaurant in the hotel. As he explored, something caught my attention. A low sound, as if something was dragging across the floor. "Did you hear that?" I wanted to ask, but he just shrugged. I continued following the sound until I reached a heavy door that led to the basement. It was slightly ajar, and the air coming from there was even colder. Daniel decided it would be a good idea to go down first, and I followed him reluctantly. The basement was bigger than we expected, filled with old boxes and rusty equipment. While Daniel rummaged through some boxes, I heard another sound. This time, it was a faint tapping, as if someone was rhythmically knocking on one of the walls. Following the direction of the noise, I pointed the flashlight into every dark corner. That's when I noticed something that made me freeze. There was a door at the back of the basement, completely intact, unlike the rest of the place. "Hey, come see this," I called Daniel. He moved over, curious, as he carefully pushed the door open. The room was small, with just a table and a chair, but there was something strange on the floor, deep scratch marks, as if someone or something had tried to get out of there. As we observed, the sound of footsteps began, this time from the upstairs. They were slow but deliberate, as if someone was pacing back and forth. "We're not alone," Daniel murmured, his voice trembling. We quickly went back up to the ground floor, but the foyer was empty just as before. The sound, however, continued, now coming from the second floor. Against our better judgment, we decided to investigate. The second floor was a long hallway, with doors on both sides. Some were ajar, revealing rooms with broken furniture and mold-covered walls. As we passed one of the doors, it slammed shut on its own, making the sound echo down the hallway. We ran toward the stairs but stopped when we heard a low laugh coming from one of the rooms. Daniel's flashlight began to flicker, blinking as it illuminated the hallway. That's when we saw it. In the doorway of one of the rooms stood a figure. It was tall, but its face was covered by shadow. It didn't move, just watched us. "Run," Daniel said, pulling my arm. We rushed down the stairs as fast as we could, but when we reached the foyer, the main door was locked. I heard footsteps coming down the stairs behind us. The sound grew louder, closer. Daniel managed to force the door open, and we bolted for the car. When I looked back, I saw the silhouette in the second floor window, watching us as we drove away. Since then, I've never gone near that hotel again. And every time I hear footsteps at night, I feel the same chill from that night. Some places were abandoned for a reason. Report 3. I never used to believe in horror stories. I always thought they were exaggerated, something to provoke quick shivers and nervous laughs. But that changed when I decided to spend a weekend in an isolated cabin with some friends. It was supposed to be a quiet break from the city, just us and nature. But what happened in that cabin changed everything. The cabin was located in a remote area, surrounded by dense forest and without cell phone signal. The place was rustic but cozy. There was a small river nearby, a functional fireplace, and only the sound of the forest around us. We arrived in the late afternoon. It was me, my friend Jonas, and his girlfriend Clara. The plan was to relax, hike a few trails, and cook over the campfire. Everything seemed perfect. But from the very beginning, something about the place made me uneasy. Maybe it was the silence, or the way the trees seemed to close in around us. Jonas mocked my discomfort. "Relax, man, it's just nature." On the first night, while we were preparing dinner, we heard a sound coming from outside. It was a crack, like a branch breaking. Jonas laughed, saying it was probably some animal. But Clara, who had always been more sensitive, seemed nervous. "It's just the wind," Jonas repeated, trying to reassure her. I wanted to believe it, but the sound continued, rhythmic, like heavy footsteps. After dinner, we chose to play cards to pass the time. The candlelight created shadows dancing on the walls, making the atmosphere even more claustrophobic. It was then that we heard the noise again. This time, it seemed to come from beneath the cabin. Jonas tried to joke again, but his voice sounded different, as if he too was starting to feel uncomfortable. I grabbed my flashlight and decided to investigate. Clara stayed behind, saying she didn't want to get involved. Outside, the air was cold, and the silence was almost oppressive. I walked around the cabin, shining the light on the ground and trying to find the source of the sound. That's when I saw it. There were marks on the ground, as if something had been dragged through the dirt. I followed the marks to the side of the cabin, where there was a small opening leading to the space under the floor. Suddenly, I heard a sound. It was no longer a crack, but a low, irregular breathing. My flashlight began to flicker, strobing as I tried to illuminate the hole. For a moment, I saw something, 2 points glinting, like eyes reflecting the light. I ran back inside and locked the door. Jonas and Clara looked at me alarmed, but I could only say, "There's something outside." Before we could decide what to do, we heard heavy footsteps on the porch. It wasn't the sound of someone casually walking, but of something that cabin. After a few minutes of silence, we gathered the courage to open one of the windows and look outside. What we saw made us freeze. On the ground, the same marks I had found earlier were now surrounding the cabin, as if something was prowling the place. We spent the night awake, listening to specific sounds, dangerous footsteps, and occasionally that same heavy breathing. The next morning, we left as quickly as we could. When I looked back, I noticed something strange on the wood of the cabin, handprints, but they were too large to be human. We never returned to that cabin. Some places in nature hold secrets that should not be uncovered.